So good evening, Rotarians and all colleagues in peace. I'm Jim Holderman, the chair of the District 5450 Peace Committee, which is the sponsor of the Forum for Discussion. It's such a joy to introduce Barbe Chambliss and her approach to conscious peacemaking. There are many peace programs speaking of the importance of more women elevated in peacemaking. So I was so thrilled to have discovered the works of Barbe pointing out that women are and have already been here. I assume you all have read the extensive background of tonight's presenter. Barbe, the floor, or in this case, the screen is now yours.
Oh, that was quick. That was quick. Thank you very much. And Jim, thank you so much for introducing me to this, even to Rotary, as well as to your specific audience. The fact that there are people watching from Burundi and from Tokyo is a real gift to an author who published the book in the middle of COVID. It kind of kills the marketing aspect of books when that happens, but it's picking up again, and the Rotary's been super important for me to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, let's see, Beth, we could put up the first. Beth is my technical help. I couldn't do this without her. I'm going to talk to you about this book. It was published in August of 2020, and it's the culmination of 30 years of interviewing women all over the world that I've been doing. I started off with 9 women, and I got so taken with the joy and the wisdom that came across in the interviews that I've now interviewed 59, almost 60 people. But the book itself, no credit to me. The writing is compelling, but more than that, the book itself is a piece of art. And I just want to introduce you a little bit to why. There were 3 women in my hometown of Carbondale who were the team that helped this book get published. And one of the most amazing ones was the graphics lady. She said, I know you've collected all these pictures from all the women that are in the book, but let me tell you how much it's going to be to publish this book. And I was blown away by how expensive it was going to be. And she said, that's because if you have one colored page in a book, the whole book has to be printed on that kind of paper. She said, look, we're going to have a colored cover. Let's put those pictures on the cover, and then let's bid out online to see if anybody can do us black and white etchings of all the women on the top. And we had 43 people answer that. And so if you look at the top left to Chito Govera, who's from Zimbabwe, you're going to see this in the book. And I think everybody that's participated in this book has been such a team and such a peacemaker team. So I also have quite a few quotes in the book as you read through them. One of my favorites is by a contemporary male peacemaker, John Paul Lederach. And his quote is, the welfare of our grandchildren is directly related to the welfare of our enemies' grandchildren. And so if you just read the quotes in this book, you would have a real gift of peacemaking. So let's go to the next slide. Because a lot of people ask me, how did you even come about looking, the whole concept of peacemaking? So once we get, I'm going to start talking about it, and it'll come up as we do. So I was born, I'm a 4th generation Denverite, but I was born, and then 15 months after I was born, my country, the United States of America, bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I don't know how spiritual you may be, but I think there's something about being born into that melee that must have seeped into me. And then when I got up into college age, so many of my fellow male students got drafted to go to Vietnam. And some of them were petrified, and they found ways to avoid the draft. And some of them were just ready to go fight. And they went to boot camp, and they came home from boot camp. And they had like 2 weeks before they were shipped off to Vietnam. And boy, could they tell me about how you make war. They knew how to shoot guns. They knew how to otherize people, so it was okay to shoot someone before they shot you. And something was so off about our conversations. And I kept saying, well, where's the boot camp for peacemaking? And then clearly I was young. I didn't know anything except the sadness of some of my fellow Vietnam soldiers that came back and that were really distraught, really wrecks. And I learned to be a trauma therapist and a couples therapist. And I also learned how to be a mediator, which has served me really well throughout my life. But when I was in my midlife, I was a single mom. Two of my kids were still living with me. And I decided to go get a PhD. Don't ask me why. I just did. And when they asked me what I wanted to study, this was at the Fielding Institute in Santa Barbara. When they asked me what I wanted to study, the word that came out of my mouth was peacemaking. So I did. I took lots of courses in colonization and things like that, and found myself in the middle of designing a dissertation that called for interviewing 9 women peacemakers. And the committee said, okay, Barb, let's see, do you even tell us what you know about peace? And I said, well, at that time, and we can go to the next slide, because this was about all I really knew about peace, which is the doorway to peace is respect, dignity, and equal opportunities. The doorway to violence is humiliation and unequal opportunities. And I mean humiliation like a dirty look. That's the first step out that door. And then it goes to bullying, and then it goes to the Ukraine situation, way down the line. So you got to watch which door you teach your kids to walk through, or that you are walking through yourself. But then they said, okay, we need a definition of peace. And I thought, okay, I'm hoping to interview women all over the world, so it can't be all tied up with the English language. So I designed a definition of peace, and we'll show it on the next slide, which is this. And you can do it with me, because then you'll learn it kinesthetically too. You put your hands together like you were going to get them filled with cool water. And this is my definition of peace. This is my definition of not peace, because there's a dominant and a subordinate element to it. And basically, it's as simple as that. So I knew I needed to find women to interview for this dissertation, and I would go to people and say, well, let's take the first people that I went to. I went to a community concert in Glenwood Springs, and it was by 5 Irish brothers. And I went backstage afterwards and I said, your concert was great, but I have a question to ask you. I said, I'm trying to get women to study for my PhD dissertation. And if I said to you, this is peace, but this is not, do you know any women in Ireland that are actually making this happen? Well, those 5 Irish brothers said, oh, no, we're the musicians. But our sister Fionnuala is a disc jockey in Dublin. Here's her telephone number. And that was how all these interviews started. So the next day I called Fionnuala and I got 2 recommendations. I got Bernadette Devlin, which some of you may even remember. And the other person was a woman named Sister Sarah Clark, who an Irish nun that lived in England, but she looked after the Irish political prisoners that were in the British jails, where they were being treated horribly. And that started my my search for all the women that were in my dissertation. When I could, I put my tuition for my PhD. It took me a while to get it, but the good news was they let me put my tuition on a mileage plus credit card. And so when I had enough miles, I would take me and one of my kids interviewing. My 9-year-old and I went to Ireland and Croatia and Israel and England. And my 21-year-old and I went to Africa together. And then there were some people that went through the United States that were from other countries. There's a woman from East Timor that I was able to interview, and a woman from Rio de Janeiro who works with the favela, the street kids. And I fell in love with, I passed the PhD. I had a wonderful committee. In fact, some of you may know the external examiner on my committee was Elise Bolding, truly a woman peacemaker. And so I had to ask these women a series of questions. And the committee said, look, you can have these nominations by random people out there, but we need a second nomination for each woman. We need her to nominate herself as a peacemaker. And I thought, well, there's a piece of cake. And it was anything but a piece of cake. I would call up these women and say, this is Barbe Chambliss. You've been nominated as a woman for me to interview for my dissertation on women peacemaker. Would you mind if I came and interviewed you? And with the exception of 2 people, they all said, oh, I would love to have you come interview me, but I'm not a peacemaker. I'm a sculptor. I'm an Olympic skier. I'm a princess. I'm a factory worker. And I didn't quite know how I was going to pull out of this until my 21-year-old said, Mom, look, ask them their definition of peace, and then ask them if the work they're doing helps bring that about. So those were my first 2 interview questions. So I would say, what's your definition of peace? And does your work bring that about? And they would go like, oh yeah, my work, that's what my work is all about. And I said, well, do you think that qualifies you as a peacemaker? And then I had to be quiet for maybe 2 to 3 minutes until I could watch on their face, I could watch them assume the mantle of being a peacemaker. Because as you'll see later, why is that important? And it's important because the violence makers never have any problem announcing their violence making. And the peacemakers were all feeling it was presumptuous to call themselves peacemakers. And what I'm saying to them now is like, get over it. We need the name of peacemaker on as many people that are actually doing this work as possible. So I also asked them, how did you find your work? How did you fund your work? Could you give me a metaphor for yourself as a peacemaker? How, if at all, does forgiveness play a role in peacemaking? What would you tell someone who wanted to become a peacemaker? Can you describe with your words, could you paint a picture with your words for me of what the world would look like if your definition of peace was in operation today? So pretty much, even though I asked this standard set of questions across the realm of these women, I got phenomenally different answers. Except for the forgiveness one, I will say. Most of them said, I have to forgive because I would be stuck. I couldn't have moved forward with my work if I didn't forgive. Some of them, a surprising number of them said, it's really hard for me to forgive unless I think it's going to be repeated. The situation that oppressed people is going to be repeated. The women will continue to get raped in Bosnia or in Guatemala or things like that. And so they said, I would first want justice, and then I could forgive, and then I can move on with my peacemaking work. So let's take a look at so the book is called Women Peacemakers, What We've Learned from Them. So what did I learn about actually this kind of peacemaking? And I will tell you, this peacemaking is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's happening a lot. It's just not called peacemaking. And it's sort of like, it reminded me of like water for fish. It's so happening all around us that we don't name it, we don't identify it, we just are glad when it happens. But to give a better definition to it, I would say that this kind of peacemaking begins with a situation where someone sees something that's not respectful, not fair or just. And it becomes a proactive, conscious act of working alongside each other. The operative words here are alongside each other, to level the playing field of opportunities so that the oppressed can empower themselves, not get empowered by you, but get to empower themselves into a place of equal choices and equal respect. So this kind of peacemaking, you know, the women don't do things like this. If they see a disparity, they don't do this. And they don't do this. This kind of peacemaking looks exactly like this. It's a partnership. It's not doing for or to anybody, because that actually is not quite equal. It is empowering the other person by working alongside of them so that they can empower themselves until there are equal opportunities. Next slide, please, Beth. So I want to explain a little bit about the difference between a spontaneous act of peacemaking and a conscious act of peacemaking. So pretend you're a 7th grade boy, a really popular boy, good athlete, and you sit at a table at lunch with the popular good boy athletes. One day you're late to come into lunch because you've been talking to a teacher for a little too long, and you come out with your tray and you look at the table and go like, "Oof, there are no places left at that table. But I really want to get out on that basketball court for recess, so I'm going to look around and find another place to sit." You go over to where there's a couple of places, in fact, a lot of places at a table, and you sit down and there's only one other kid at the table. And you strike up a conversation with them. And it's a pretty cool conversation, but you're anxious to get out to the playground. So you pick up your tray to go to the dish cleaning place. And the kid says, "You know, thank you so much for sitting here. Nobody's sat here all year." And you go like, "Oh, right. I do remember that this table has been mostly empty the whole time." And you go like, "Well, it was really nice talking to you." And then you go put your dishes in the dishwasher and go out to play basketball. That is a spontaneous act of peacemaking. The more we have of those, the better. But here's the difference. The conscious act of peacemaking happens the next day. The kid walks out of the cafeteria and decides where he's going to sit himself down. And that's the beginning of a conscious peacemaking, because in conscious peacemaking, you ask yourself every single day if you want to continue with this work. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So when you're doing a PhD, usually what you do is you have a theory and you go out and do the research and you either prove it or disprove it, and then you come up with your conclusion. Well, I did it totally backwards. I just went out and got all the information, and I had to go find a theory to fit it. And it was really hard to do. I looked at lots of different theories about peacemaking, and there was only one person that I really felt nailed it. It was a Brit. He died not long after I met him, but his name is Adam Curl. And what Adams is on the left, you can see the words, he believes it doesn't work to make peace from the top down. What is needed is a small number of ordinary people with the potential to be change agents. So if you look at the lower right square, this represents people that are so oppressed that sometimes they don't even know it, and they certainly don't know why, and they don't know how to get out of it. Usually they're poverty stricken, they don't have any education, they don't have resources or anything like that. And that's a very static situation, because the power structure likes it this way. And the main tool for doing peacemaking with them is education. Lots of the women in this book have done education projects. And when the people get educated enough to understand what's been going on, they move up to number 2, to the confrontation square. And that's when you have people doing protests or wanting to form unions or things like that. And they make a lot of noise. And if they're lucky, they have destabilized this stuck position enough to start getting to move over to item number 3, which is negotiating. They get a seat at the peacemaking table. They run for office and they become legislators. They change a situation in a school, things like that. So they're negotiating, they are making settlements, they're bargaining. And if that goes well, it moves up to item number 4, which is a sustainable peace. And actually, peace is never like this, it's like this all the time. It's a moving target. And that is where there's the development of equivalent opportunities and restructuring of the formerly unpeaceful relations. And if you look at the white lines along the left side of this square, it says grassroots is the negotiating, the confrontation and the negotiating and the sustainable peace element. But the lower one is the tree roots level. It's harder to see, and they're embedded. So that's the theory for what kind of peacemaking goes on here. And Beth, I think what we're going to do for slide 9 and 10, maybe on behalf of time, I'll just go over these really quickly. So you'll see that the table of contents of who's here, where they're from, you can glance at it while I talk for a little while. 8 of these women are international, meaning they are not from the United States. And they're doing projects like Chito Govera is doing, she's helping, she herself was an AIDS orphan, and she's making a huge difference in the futures for AIDS orphans in Zimbabwe. Another one is Ruhama Marton in Israel, is a psychiatrist, and she is getting fair healthcare for everybody that lives in Israel, whether they're Palestinian, Israeli, Druze, Christian, prisoners, refugees, anything like that. Muffy Davis, number 7, is an Olympic skier that on one of her qualifying races, right before she was going to be put on the Olympic team, got paralyzed. She went off and hit her head and paralyzed herself. Sister Mary Veritucci is a woman that's doing the work in Arusha, Tanzania. She's now made education possible for hundreds of Tanzanian girls that heretofore really, even though it was a state requirement that they get educated, there just weren't the schools. So she's made it possible. And in doing so, she's pretty much turned around the Maasai Nation from going what she called extinct. Another woman from Guatemala, Chona, her form of peacemaking is that she would give piñata birthday parties to the Guatemalan widows that had barely made it through the genocide in Guatemala. Okay, next one. So I won't go, try not, Inga Sargent met her husband, who was a Burmese prince, when she went to Denver University, fell in love with him, went home with him, and upgraded the entire Burmese birthing system so that the birth rate of kids that died and mothers that died diminished totally. Shahala Wali, she ran a construction project in Iraq. 4 months worth of a construction project in Fallujah, underneath all the bullets flying from the US military, underneath Saddam Hussein, who wanted her off the streets. And the story of how she did that is phenomenal, I have to say. Samboon, I met in Thailand, and she cast the first, class action suit against an employer of a factory that made clothing. People were dying in the factory because there were no safety measures, and she hung in there for 11 years and finally got a settlement for hundreds of people by filing a lawsuit. Theo Coburn is from my town of Paonia, Colorado. Theo's research has informed us of the role petroleum products play in the development of a fetus. It's a fascinating chapter. So she was out here. She was a really well-researched scientist. She came to live in Paonia, where fracking was happening all the time. And by hook and by crook, she got all the information she needed to prove that petroleum chemicals actually shorten fertility. They affect autism, ADD, things like that. Yvonne de Mello is a woman from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and she works with the favela kids, the shantytown kids. Alyssa Montanti is a woman in, oh, hang on a minute, I'll tell you. It's a little tiny island off of New York City. Everybody knows it. I'll tell you what it is in a second here. But she found a way to bring kids and adults, but kids mostly, that had had wartime accidents. They'd lost arms, they'd lost eyes in landmine accidents, or kids that were Staten Island, that's where she lives, or kids that had been had major trauma and physical stuff happen to them in weather and climate processes. She brings there and gets them she gets them prosthesis, she gets them eyesight care, she gets large goiters on the side of their heads operated on by some amazing physicians in just north of New York. So those were the 15 chapters, but I have to tell you that about halfway through collecting the items for the interviews, one day I opened my mailbox, and there was a letter from a friend of mine that said, I just got this request for funds, and I think you might be interested in it for your peacemaking work. So there was a name on it of Judith Genya, and she had an organization called Global Children's Organization. And I called her up. She lived in Los Angeles, and I called her up and I said, I've known about this war just a little bit. It makes me feel terrible, really uneasy. Can you tell me what you're doing? She said, I'm going to have a camp, 2-week camp, to give the kids that have been through the Bosnian War 2 weeks of safe play, which they have not had for 4 years. I said, wow, I don't have any money to contribute to your camp, but if you're going to bring them to Los Angeles, where you live, I can cook for you, or I'll clean toilets, or I'll do anything, but I would like to contribute to the betterment of these kids. She said, you're on. It's all about volunteerism, and you're going to get more out of this than the kids will. So she said, I just want to tell you one thing. It's not going to be in Los Angeles. It's going to be in Croatia. So I pulled up my big girl pants and found a way to fill up 2 duffel bags with all the things that you need at camp, like swimming suits, like music, like toys, like costumes, like dance music, and went over and spent 2 weeks with these kids. Half of them were from Sarajevo, who had watched their beautiful capital get totally destroyed, just like pictures you're now seeing of Ukraine. And the other half of the kids were from a place called Srebrenica, which was a rural area where, after the peace accord was signed, the Serbs went in and they took every male that was over the age of 14 and they killed them. They either shot them in front of their families or they took them to mass graves that are just now being unearthed. The mothers and the younger children all had to escape through the woods to go to a town called Tuzla. And so half of the kids were those escapee kids that had gone to Tuzla. And both groups of kids begged us to stay a week longer and come visit Sarajevo and visit their refugee center in Tuzla. And what they said was, look, could you just come see what it was? So when you go back, you could talk to people about what happened here? Because we don't think anybody knew that all this was going on, because if they knew, why would they let it go on for 4 years? So when I was on the airplane coming back, all I can remember saying to myself is, I cannot make this an academic exercise anymore. I have to do something about this. And so I took on this stand in my life. I still stand on this stand that says, I want to wake up the active, conscious peacemaker in as many people as I can while I'm alive. And you'll see that in the book, chapter 18 actually puts out a request to the reader or to the listener. I had time to actually record the book, that asks them to either do an act of peacemaking or remember an act of peacemaking that they have done. and write it up and email it to me, because I'm now collecting more and more peacemaking stories. And yeah, let's just leave that there. It's been a mission, and I'm on it. And if you want to help me out with it, I will be grateful. I will collect your stories. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So I want to tell you about one of the people that I interviewed for this. And this is Connie Neen. Connie lives near all of you. In fact, for the first time ever, Jim Halderman has given me the gift of inviting Connie and her husband, Ted Neen, to be part of this Zoom group. And it's the first time I've seen Connie since pre-COVID. Connie started off, I'm going to read you just three quick quotes about that are in her chapter. Connie was actually, when I interviewed, I said, how did you get your start? She said, I was a psychotherapist with my husband, and I had 6 kids, 3 birth kids, 1 child from Vietnam and 2 from Korea. And my life was full. She said, if you had told me that I would be doing some of the things I did later, I wouldn't believe it. Her husband, Ted, went to Vietnam, but he went with the health services. And when he got back, he wanted to go visit the orphanages and the hospitals that he had worked at, because he wanted to see how people were doing. And it took a long time for that to happen, because there was no diplomatic relationships between Vietnam and the United States after the war. So this is a quote from the book. After several years, Ted and Connie were able to go to Vietnam. Connie described the conditions as abysmal. It was like visiting a medieval hospital. In the nursery, there were rats around the milk, and there were women dying postpartum because the doctors didn't have soap to wash their hands. They didn't have any pain meds either. No antibiotics and no pain meds. That's what political sanctions do. And the diplomat that was showing us around didn't even know how bad things were. There was a woman in the hall. She was dying of cervical cancer, which is totally preventable. And her husband was holding her hand next to her. She was young, and I looked into her eyes, and I just lost it. She spoke to me in a way, I cried and cried and cried uncontrollably. She spoke to me in a way that I just can't verbalize. All that suffering was so unnecessary. It was ridiculous. It was inhuman. That woman should not be suffering like it, nor should anybody be suffering like it, much less that way. So I went back to my hotel room, and then I became very mad, because I was in a choiceless situation. I truly mean it was choiceless. I just knew I had to return to Vietnam with some antibiotics and some pain meds. There was no other. I'm no heroine. It's just the way it was. So I went home and I talked to friends. And so began Friendship Bridge, a nonprofit organization that she co-founded. And who was the co-founder? I asked. The Vietnamese woman in the hallway, she replied unpretentiously. If she hadn't looked in my eyes, there would have been no Friendship Bridge. She died 2 weeks later. I thought as the interviewer. It was true that there would be no Friendship Bridge without the woman who looked in Connie's eyes. But there also would have been no Friendship Bridge if Connie's soul had not been open on that day at that time. So Connie came home and started collecting medical material, surgery kits, antibiotics, everything she could, equipment, until she had, I think, what was it? Connie, you probably know better, 120 tons of stuff to ship over to Vietnam. So then she had to find a way to get it over there. And she started having exchanges between Vietnamese doctors coming to the US and US doctors going to Vietnam. And she was really busy with this project. And then here's another quote from the book. And somewhere along the way, Connie told me she got bored. When I asked why, her answer revealed that it wasn't the boredom of someone who has too little to do. It was the boredom of someone who is only scratching the surface of a bigger situation. And then this is her quote. For one thing, you could see it was just a black hole of endless needs. Endless. What is causing all this cholera and polio and malaria? Well, it's poverty. So what causes poverty? Economic disadvantages. I think people who are poor see themselves as beasts of burden. Their lives are just barely putting one foot in front of the other, almost unable to think because they're so tired and so hungry. I couldn't stay in their shoes for a couple of hours, half a day, and I would be flat on my nose in the middle of a road. So Connie kept going to Vietnam, but what she gathered in America this time was money. Very successful fundraiser. And she started issuing microloans. And she told me that she started it all wrong. When they first did microloans, they did them all wrong. They gave them to men. They didn't have interest. They didn't have group meetings. They didn't help men learn how to start businesses. And so they figured out they had to do it better next time. But right at this time, Mohammed Yunus had gotten the Nobel Peace Prize for the Grameen Bank. So Connie went and studied with him. And then she started giving microloans to women, charging interest, helping them start businesses. And by the time she completed that project, she was giving, I think, Connie, you could correct me, but I think it was 5,000 microloans a year. And then, interestingly enough, that project sort of got subsumed by the Vietnamese, and Connie and Ted were on a vacation down in Guatemala, around Lake Atitlan for Christmas. And by hook and by crook, a story that's worth reading in the book, they ended up doing microloans for women who had barely made it through the war. The genocide down there was identified as a war made by men on women's back. So there were lots of men killed in this genocide, pretty much most of them Mayan, a lot of young boys taken and made into soldiers, so they had to come back and kill their own people, and a lot of women raped and abused terribly. So by the time the war was over, Connie could see that there was such a need to be able to lift up the women somehow. She did this by doing microloans very successfully. The women repaid the money. They got villages, they got tiendas, they got little businesses in their villages going. And she said to them, if you want to take out a second loan, we'll educate your elementary school kids. And these kids had never, the parents had never been to school, and the Mayan kids hadn't either. And so that started to happen. They paid for the uniforms and for the school supplies and things like this. And a whole cadre of these kids came up through elementary school, and Connie looked at herself and said, well, we can't stop now. We've got to get these kids through middle school. And then we can't stop there. We got to get these kids through high school. And then they gave the kids that did that several choices. They could get a job, they could start their own business, or they could go to university, which was a huge leap for these kids. And she and Ted, the last I knew, and Connie will tell you much of what's happening now, she and Ted were raising scholarship money for the Mayan kids to go from the lake area, clear by bus, into the university and back often, and get educations as nurses and as doctors and as tour guides and as things, often bringing their skills back to their communities, their Mayan communities. So this is the quote I picked out for her. Forget the incremental change stuff. These women are leaping over 4 to 5 generations. Can the daughter of an illiterate single mother become a physician? We think so. And we're going to find out what happens when she does. So that's a teeny bit about Connie that I hope she will be able to tell you the whole story about herself. It's a really beautiful story. Okay, we can go here. So here's I was able to, in chapter 17 of the book, I could have called it the recipe for how to do this kind of peacemaking, or boot camp's instructions for how to do conscious peacemaking. And as I hung these women's stories up around a room, and then I just went from one to another, these women never met each other, none of them. They still haven't met each other. But there was some lines of consistency about how they went about their work. And if you get the book, that's all outlined in chapter 17 of the book, but I just have a few of them here to show you. The first one is be awake when the opportunity presents itself. Have your soul open when the woman with cervical cancer looks in your eyes, would be a good way to give you an example. The next one is never lose sight of your goal and never get attached to how you get there, because you will get knocked off your path right and left, and you have to hold a steady goal out there for yourself. Number 3 is do not use violence of any kind, including to yourself. Every day, revisit the wisdom of and your willingness to do this work. Pace yourself. Make a little peace and make a little dinner. These women are in their work for the long haul. Some of them have even passed away and found successors because their work wasn't complete by the time they reached the end of their lives. So this is really different than, say, a protest, which gets organized over 2 or 3 weeks, and then it happens, and then the energy level goes down. This is a long, slow, operating out of patience and persistence at the same time. By the way, I just want to do one more thing and read you one of the very last quotes in the book about Connie. At the end of the interview, I asked Connie if she had anything else she wanted to add. She was silent for a minute and then spoke of another metaphor for herself that touched me deeply. It seemed to describe all the women peacemakers that I'd been interviewing. She said, actually, I'm sort of a conduit. I'm a pass-through. I feel like it's not me that's making it happen because things just couldn't work out this well on my own. When I asked her what was passing through her, she tilted her head and said simply, grace. So let's look for a minute at, are we doing okay with time? I think we are. We're doing okay. Why would someone do this kind of peacemaking? Well, the first reason is so simple. It's because it works. If I've interviewed 60 women that don't even know each other, that were anonymously recommended to me, and their work is as successful, there's phenomenal aspects of peacemaking, then I would say this recipe works. It's also very regenerative, which means my definition of regenerative means you leave a place in better shape when you leave than when you came. And that's always true with these peacemaking projects. Number 3 is it changes things at both the individual and the systems level. Let's go back and say, I mean, if you look at Connie's project, these young women are not only up in the world and able to support themselves and reach out to the world, but they're reaching back to their own villages. So they're better as individuals, and so is the whole system that has supported them. Number 4, it's reciprocally uplifting. If you really look at this kind of peacemaking, it's really hard for one of these people to do it without the other one going. One of them may, in fact, be able to tie down an education for herself, but her partner is going to gain some really beautiful things from partnering. I saw a sign in a store in Berkeley one time that said, you don't have to be famous to be unforgettable. And I'm telling you, one thing that will happen when you do peacemaking like this, you will be totally unforgettable to your partner in this process. What more could we want before we move on to the next life that we have? The 5th reason is because it balances out the multiple acts of violence reported in the media. It's pretty darn hard these days to find anything about peacemaking, but it's going on all the time, I promise you. And so the more we can stand up as peacemakers, get media coverage of it, or just teach it to as many kids as we can. The media can go on talking about their violent stories if they want, but it's not going to have the same impact as if we talk about the peacemaking too. Number 6, it promotes win-win rather than win-lose. This is not even about political competition or about competition with sports. This is about collaboration through and through. It teaches the joy, the skills for, and the persistence for doing things collaboratively. Number 7, if we don't do it, who will? And number 8 is because this is a pretty bold statement, because it has the potential to make war irrelevant. Why would I say anything like a statement like this? It's because when I went over the interview that I did with a woman from Israel, I read this quote she did over and over again, and I thought, well, that's nice. Oh, well, that's good. Well, I can see how her work reflected that. But the more I looked at it, I was pretty blown away. So let's look at the slide of Ruhama Marton. And what she said that I finally just got was, when peace is made, it's a synonym for respect. So that's where this came from. And she further said, when people respect each other, they're willing to share power. Think about that. A woman who's been living with the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict blowing up all the time. And she has seen examples of sharing power. That can make war irrelevant. So I think we have one more slide that from one of the women. I interviewed a clan mother up at Standing Rock. And she has the wisdom of the Mayan, years and years of the Mayan teachings and of the Native American teachings. And they all kind of came together in this interview I did with her. But she said, it's pretty well clear from all of the teachings that we should all acknowledge that each one of us were put on this planet at this important time in history for a reason. It's our duty and our responsibility to speak up for the voiceless. And then let's go to one more question, like, who is it that does these acts of peacemaking? Well, clearly the women in the book did them. And I also want you to continue to think about yourself as one of these kinds of peacemakers. If you've heard anything that I've talked about today that gives you a memory, you went like, oh, I think that was an act of peacemaking. Or, boy, have I seen something down the street from where I live that I would like to go see if a little peacemaking might make a big difference too. I want you to don't close out listening to this talk by letting go of those little reminders that have come to you. I turn this off. And I'd like you to consider yourself, every one of you, as a peacemaker. And if you want to tell me your story, you'll have information at the end of this presentation about that. We also have, I've done a lot of talks to book clubs and to UAW groups and things like that. And I've asked them if any of them have stories, and I've actually gotten a total of 3, which I will take every peacemaker story I can. One was a school teacher who taught at a school that was way overcrowded. And she went and took a course in conflict resolution to cope with the stress she was under. And one of the things they recommended that she do was to get rid of the rows in her classroom and create a circle of students. And in hindsight, she said that turned out to be an act of peacemaking. It changed the entire dynamic for each of these kids, for their learning ability, for their social ability, and for everything. And she was right. It was an act of peacemaking. Another woman turned in a story about moving to a new condominium, and all the people that were there went to her and said, watch out for the lady that lives above you. She's crazy. So she made it her goal to see how crazy this lady was, and found out the lady had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And she decided, instead of considering her the crazy woman upstairs, she would befriend her. And in doing so, she has actually helped lessen some of the symptoms. And she's helped the other people in the condominium actually treat this woman with much, much more respect. And a third woman had a son that went overseas to do some of his studying, and then he died very shortly after he came back. And she and her husband, in the name of her son, has sponsored overseas fellowships for, I don't know, 150 young people now. And Verena stays in touch with every single one of those kids that have gone overseas to study. So 3 was 3, but it wasn't enough. So I remembered reading a book called, what was it that Jack Canfield wrote? He wrote a book called,
What I learned in grade school.
say it again.
What I learned in grade school.
Well, he learned in great, he did write that one, but he also wrote Chicken Soup. He wrote the whole
Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Yeah, Chicken Soup for the Soul. And he couldn't get it out there to anybody. And he failed 50 times to market the book. And finally he got it out there. But then all of a sudden, he spawned off 100 other books. Chicken Soup for the Gardener, Chicken Soup for the troubled teen, Chicken Soup for the baseball player. And I went to Jack and I said, Jack, how did you get that many stories? And he said, Barb, you have to go after the stories. I went, right. Okay, so what am I doing now? I am inviting anybody, not just women, but men, children, veterans, immigrants, corporations, animals. I'm collecting their stories, and I'll take all the help I can getting those stories to me. But the other thing I did was I decided what population could I make the most difference going after? And I decided it was high school kids. So in my town of Paonia, there's a private school called the Paonia Experiential Leadership Academy, or PELA. So I taught conscious peacemaking right from this book to the upper school kids. They were required to read 10 chapters of the book and do a reflection after each chapter about what they learned about peacemaking. Then they listened to 5 talks from me about how to do it, how to fund it, things like that. And then they had to do an act of peacemaking. And for that, for doing that, Beth, we can go to the, yes, for doing that, they each got a certificate of conscious peacemaking from the National Peace Academy. And they put this on their college applications or on their job applications when they were done. And the Pella kids, their act of peacemaking, here they are, they were so proud. What they did for their act of peacemaking was interview elders around our town. There were a lot of elders that were identified as feeling invisible, feeling isolated. COVID especially did that. These kids interviewed 16 elders in our community, videotaped these conversations with them, and then played the videotapes at our local theater. And so the whole community packed our theater. It would COVID empty, went to fully packed. And so the whole community got to see and lift up their image of these elder people. The other school that I taught at was in Crestone. I taught the seniors down there, the seniors and juniors down there, this class. They too got certificates from the National Peace Academy. And their act of peacemaking was that they turned around and taught the 4th and 5th graders. I had done a lot of teaching to 4th and 5th graders how to be mediators. So I taught the high school kids how to teach mediation to the 4th and 5th graders. And that school has a cadre of mediators for the next 8 years. So just to close this out and just let you know, this is not my poem, but I think it's a beautiful poem, and it's a quiet way for us to contemplate the whole act of peacemaking. Peacemaking does not mean passivity. It's the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressors free. So that concludes my rapid fire description of this book and any role you could play in it and any role I could play in it.
Well, there's the information. Barb, we can't thank you enough. That's fantastic. We're so excited. And your last poem to me is so much more, that's a whole philosophy in itself. I love that. And everything you've had to offer. We have time for a few questions. Thank you. Are there any questions? And use the reaction and put up their hands.
Jim, I actually have a very quick question that I will put out there, and I don't know if he's on the Zoom, but if Fulgence is on this Zoom, I can't see him because well, let's see, I could if I go to.
Not sure he is tonight. I don't see him tonight.
Okay, so because I listened to your program last time, I'm very interested in Fulgence's work as a peacemaker. So I will be trying to get in touch with him and see if we can create his story.
And Fasanti from India is asking for some of your information. Fasanti, Rotary Peace Activator, Asia cohort, would love to have the high school kids share their stories over Zoom next Rotary year, Create Hope. I work as a peace activator with high school kids. Would love to have email. I will connect the two of you after this.
Okay, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Santi is very active in peacemaking in many, many ways, many levels. Thank you so much. And very exciting to have the Nings with us tonight and hear the stories. You know, my heart goes out. That is just so wonderful. One of the things that you talked about is the importance of media. You are so right. There is so much good going on. The media seems to only make money if they talk about bad. Life is perception. And I also, in one of the speeches I'm running around with, I talk about the truth is when you believe it, you'll see it. We've always said for years, the other way around. I'll believe it. I'm sorry, the other way around. Whoops. We've always said, I'll believe it when I see it. But the truth is, you'll see it when you believe it.
Mm-hmm.
It's our belief that guides our thoughts. It's our belief that causes our actions and drives us. And so the importance of the media, anything that we can do to get these stories out. Linda Loft, you have a question.
Oh, not a question, but those of you that live in Colorado area, and that would be in Denver area, Barb, Cleo Parker Robinson is a tremendous peacemaker. It's her 53rd year with her dance company, bringing together people of all races and ethnicities. And May 12th, 13th, and 14th is a performance, and it's in the church in 5 Points. It was the church, like Martin, I forget the name of it, like Martin Luther King was a part of that church, and it's a historical landmark. But Cleo, her mission is peace. She traveled with her companies, traveled all over the world, and every performance is peace, love, and respect for everybody.
Oh, nice.
She's an incredible spiritual person. I just saw her today, and there's a link that maybe I can send to Jim, but she is in the 90s was part of the National Council of the Arts. She and the other women that started the Black Artists just received the medals that Biden just gave out last week. The national recognition aisle. So I would encourage all of you that can go look her up, Cleo Parker Robinson Dance, go to the performance May 12th, 13th, or 14th.
Can we get
And-
tickets online?
Yes,
Okay,
then get to know her. She's the most peaceful, spiritual person that I think anyone could ever meet.
she and my sister went to school together, so I knew her as a teenager, but I have
Yeah.
not known about her work as an adult.
Yeah,
Right.
she started that when she the program right out of college, and her and her husband. Her husband worked with the company, but also taught at Regis and did sports. He recently died, and this little couple have made an impact. There was, between Zoom and in person, I think there was something like 600 people at his funeral. That's
my-
what an
that-
impact he made on the community. Yeah.
Their story would be a good story together, family peacemakers.
Yeah, look at Cleo Parker Robinson Dance. There's all kinds of information, including the newsletter that talked about the trip to Washington, D.C.
Okay,
stuff. Yeah.
She's quite a story and quite a person too, and that would go well. And we have time for one more question, if so. Barbara Mueller.
Thank you. It's not so much a question, except it's an exclamation. Now I know why I can't put the book down. As soon as Barb sent me the book, I have not been able to stop reading it and rereading it. And I think your passion, Barb, comes through in each of these interviews. Your passion for peace, the questions you ask, and your sensitivity in the way you write them. So how long did it take you to write this book? That's my question.
30 years, including the interviewing and the transcribing, which I did up at my yurt because I didn't have Wi-Fi up there, and then writing up the stories and getting them published. Took about 30 years.
So
And it
then
was
you
every
started
minute of
writing, you started writing when you were 5.
Thank you very much. Very
Uh,
nice.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, thank you, Barb. It's I cannot tell you, if you have not read her book, you are in for a treat. Buy the book. That's all I can say. It's just you want to I keep it by my bed, because if I can't sleep, and that's never happening because I'm so busy during the day, but if I couldn't sleep, I'd get up and I just read this book because there's so much inspiration. And it does begin with something. It becomes with what you said. When you see something, you haven't got a choice. You must take care of it, and you must bring the peace. Thank you.
Well, and I want to just let people know that if you go to the website, which is barbchamblissauthor.com, you can order the book right off of there, either from Amazon. A lot of people would rather not there, or from some place called Bookstore. And I called the Tattered Cover today, and they have 3 copies there and would be happy to restock their supply.
Fantastic.
And also you can order, if you go further down, you can order the audiobook. I'm not on Audible right now. We're working on that, but I'm with an audio company that is worldwide. So people in Tanzania and Tokyo can actually order the audio.
Just connected you to by email. Fulgence finally joined us.
Oh,
Fulgence, and Fulgence, what time is it there now for you? So I can get it right.
Hi, Jim. Hi, everybody. Right now is 3:35 a.m. in Burundi.
Oh,
East
my
Africa.
goodness.
thank you for whatever you did to show up, Fulgence.
Thank you for sharing. Anyway, thank you so much, Barb. What a special treat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And my book is on order. I didn't have it tonight, but I will have it soon, and I'm looking forward to going through it. And I just may call up the names and have them tell me the stories from person to person. Thank you, Connie and Ted, for joining tonight. Thank you, all of you, for joining. Great. Barb, again, truly, truly a blessing. Thank you. And again, help us to move our focus. So next week, we want everybody to be at the PeaceCon, the International Peace Conference in Birmingham, Alabama. And would hope that you would all take a look at Peace Conference 2023, bham.com. That's Peace Conference 2023, bham.com to get more information on the phenomenal programs that will be going on. One of which is it starts with a program that we'll talk about and share stories. There will be 35 to 40 Peace Fellows from all over the world doing the phenomenal things. What we learned was many Rotarians send money and support the Peace Fellow program with little knowledge of what they really do. And so we're trying to bridge that gap with the first part of the Peace Conference by bringing in all of these Peace Fellows and Rotarians, and let's learn how we can support one another, what we can learn. As Jim Roxlow points out, your Peace Fellows have very specific knowledge and very specific emphasis, whereas Rotarians have all kinds of emphasis and a shorter span. And so it's the coming together, and it's going to be a valuable experience. So because of that, that's May 4th, 5th, and 6th. We will be dark next month, but we will be back together in June with more information and more knowledge on how we can change this world, one person, one act at a time. But we'd like to hurry up, and so could some of you do 2 acts at a time. So with that, we thank you, and God bless, good night, and peace to all.